Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, April 6th, day 547 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda.
We are going to learn about the first signs of life since October 7th, 2023 for two Israeli hostages that are held by Hamas. We'll also hear a follow-up to the IDF investigations into the killings of 14 medics in Gaza and get more clarity on this very troubling event. Manny will fill us in on the targeted killing of a high-ranking Hamas officer in Lebanon, and we'll learn where troops are currently operating in the Gaza Strip in what is being called a new phase of the war. All this and more when we're back.
I like what I do as a Jew, and I find it interesting and meaningful, but I want to learn about what's out there and how do the rest of our people connect.
You come in knowing some things, but nobody here knows everything, because everyone has had like puzzle pieces, and together we kind of make up this whole larger puzzle.
I think the Hartman Fellowship has impacted me as a Jewish leader more than any other Jewish program that I've done, because it sort of broadened my horizon on what exactly it means to be a Jewish teen and what sort of Jewish teen learning looks like.
The Saudi Al-Hadath channel reported this morning that the U.S. has transferred a second THAAD battery to Israel amid rising tensions over Iran's nuclear program. The battery was apparently delivered yesterday. So the THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, and it's an advanced anti-missile system that has been used quite a bit even recently. So Manny, tell us about when and where it's being used.
So the THAAD battery has been used several times, including recently against Houthi missiles fired at Israel. So this system is what you would call integrated with the Israeli air defense systems. So in previous years, Israel and the US carried out joint drills. The Americans brought the THAAD battery here, and they basically practiced and simulated attacks on Israel and the deployment and the use of the system to basically counter such threats. And then the first battery was brought here around last year when there was escalations with Iran. It's comparable to the sort of the Arrow system or the Patriot system that Israel used to have and no longer uses, essentially being able to hit targets ranges of up to around 200 kilometers. So it's another medium to long range interceptor. It's not like the Arrow, which is sometimes even the Arrow 3 is much more long range, but it is basically a complementary system that Israel has now, basically. So American soldiers are on the ground, they operate it. There's one of these batteries is in southern Israel in the desert, and it has been used. There's been at least 3 or 4 times in recent weeks with these Houthi missiles. The Houthis have fired more than 10 missiles at Israel, and several of them have indeed been knocked down by the THAAD or by the THAAD and Israeli air defense systems at the same time. So the Americans are now deploying a second battery here, possibly amid these tensions surrounding Iran's nuclear program. We don't know exactly why, and we haven't seen an official comment yet from either Israel or the Americans, but it has been reported that that's what was delivered yesterday. We saw on flight tracking websites an American transport plane landing at the Nevatim Air Base in southern Israel. This specific transport plane, the C-5M Super Galaxy, the largest US transport plane, very rare for them to show up here. So we should expect some sort of comment from officials at some point.
So as you mentioned, with this THAAD missile battery comes American soldiers. Do you know plus minus how many American soldiers have boots on the ground in Israel right now?
I don't know an exact number, but it's enough to basically operate the system and anything else that the Americans do here.
Okay, and a final question. Of course, you and I were a bit joking off screen, off mic last week because CENTCOM head Carrillo was here. I can't recall his exact title. And every time he comes by, it seems like it's an indication that things are heating up with Iran. So would you put these pieces together and say that indeed we should be a bit more wary and perhaps restock our sheltered spaces from the previous Iran missile attack?
I wouldn't be too worried unless some specific instructions are given to Israelis. But generally, yeah, it's a little spooky when Kurilla shows up. It's always been when he shows up, there's something happening. But he has shown up a few times where nothing major has happened, so I wouldn't be worried too much.
Okay, great. So let's turn to yesterday when Hamas released yet another propaganda video, this time showing hostages by Kupershtein and Maxim Herkin. And this is the first sign of life that anyone has gotten since October 7th, 2023 from the pair. Manny, are you able to tell us a little bit about what was on the video? The family asked for it not to be screened, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, the family has asked not to publish the video, but it is very similar to the other videos that we've seen already so far, released by Hamas, generally released on Saturdays. Hamas knows that releasing it on a Saturday evening right before the protests are set to take place, the protests in support of a hostage deal, releasing the hostages, is aimed to create pressure among the Israeli public. And try to pressure the Israeli government on releasing the hostages. So what we saw in the video is again very similar to previous ones. The hostages are basically asking Israel to help secure their release and demanding that protests continue in order to pressure the government, to pressure the prime minister to release the hostages and reach a deal. But at the same time, of course, we know from, at least from Israel, that Hamas is not agreeing to the current Israeli demands on the release of the hostages. So it's really sort of very difficult, I think, to see these videos and you see the hostages really begging for their release, and then we know that on the ground that Israel and Hamas are not really finding any agreement, and the fighting is resumed. It's really, really difficult.
And of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was updated with the video. He's currently in Budapest and flying to the U.S. to Washington, D.C. today. Now, Manny, let's turn to a saga that you and I discussed on Thursday, and we found it disturbing then. I have to say that after a bit of an IDF investigation, I find it no less disturbing. And the IDF has detailed the initial findings from its investigation into the killing of 14 rescue workers in southern Gaza's Rafah on March 23rd, when soldiers opened fire on a convoy of ambulances after mistakenly identifying it as a threat, and then buried their bodies. So the incident is being investigated by the highest level of investigation that we have at this point, isn't it, Manny? And tell us a little bit about the initial findings of this higher level probe into this completely disturbing situation.
So the army last night detailed its initial findings, although they're not completed yet. Today, this investigation is going to be concluded. In addition to this investigation carried out by the Southern Command, there's also a higher level investigation by an independent military body called the General Staff Fact-Finding Assessment Mechanism, or something like that. That's sort of somewhat external investigation and not related to the details that I'll give you now. But from the Southern Command investigation, the Golani soldiers on March 23 were deployed in an ambush in Rafah. They deployed themselves on a road, and for a short while, several ambulances and civilians passed through this road without any incident. But then around half an hour into this, while they were waiting in this ambush, a Hamas police vehicle drove by, and the army says that the troops exchanged fire with those Hamas members, killing one and taking two others, basically detaining them. And from that point, this Hamas vehicle remained on the side of the road, and around an hour and a half later, or an hour later, this convoy of ambulances arrived, and a drone that was flying overhead, the operators notified the Golani soldiers that several vehicles were moving toward them in a suspicious manner. These ambulances then stopped on the road in front of the soldiers and next to this Hamas vehicle that had been abandoned. And the medics inside, who the soldier didn't realize they were medics, jumped out of the vehicles very quickly and started running towards the ambulance, or maybe towards the soldiers. The soldiers weren't very sure. At that point, the soldiers opened fire at the medics, sort of thinking that they were some sort of threat because of the way that they stopped, because of the information they got from the drone. What the major discrepancy that's now been revealed is that in the army's initial response to the incident, they said that these vehicles had their lights off, didn't have their headlights on, didn't have their the ambulance sort of lights on, and a video published over the weekend by the New York Times clearly reveals that the lights were actually on in the vehicle. So the army is now investigating this discrepancy as to what happened there. Maybe the first vehicle in the convoy didn't have its lights on, and that's why they reported it as such. But it's basically the testimony of the soldiers was wrong, and that's why the army's response was actually incorrect. The other sort of...
I just want to stop you here. The lights being on or off is a factor, of course, because of the hour in which this took place, all of these incidents. So
this
nail
happened
that down
overnight.
for us.
Yeah, this happened overnight. The shooting of the convoy was around 6 a.m. when it was still somewhat dark, and the army had deployed to this this ambush area at around 4 a.m. So it was an overnight incident, and therefore the lights is a relevant factor.
Now, muddying the whole thing a little bit more for me is the fact that now the IDF is saying that 6 of these 14 medics are or were actually Hamas operatives. So what does that mean?
So it means that the soldiers didn't really they weren't targeting these ambulances because they thought they were Hamas operatives. They thought it was a threat. But after they were killed, the army did an initial check of their identities, and it was revealed by intelligence officials that at least 6 were identified positively as Hamas operatives. Were they active at the time, or were they Hamas operatives who are now working as medics? It's not completely clear, and the army says it will detail their identities later once the investigation is completed. But regarding the burying of the bodies...
Exactly. The burial is so disturbing, but what I'm reading is that this is actually somewhat according to protocol.
Yeah, so the army is saying that this is according to protocol and not an attempt by the soldiers to sort of cover up the killing of these medics. In fact, according to the army's probe, they say that immediately after the killing of these medics, they covered the bodies in sand in order to prevent wild animals, especially wild dogs, from eating the corpses. Is something that's unfortunately very common in Gaza, and there's lots and lots of wild dogs in Gaza right now. And the army says that it marked the burial spot and then immediately notified the UN to come collect the bodies. And the army says that this is protocol in Gaza. Whenever such an incident occurs, they usually bury the bodies to prevent animals from basically trying to reach the corpses. The UN was unable to find the bodies when it arrived there the next day, and the soldiers weren't around either because they were busy with another task. So they re-coordinated with the UN to show up a few days later, and they eventually did, and then the bodies were removed. I'll add one more thing, is that next to the bodies, they also found the mangled remains of the ambulances and one fire truck. And the armies explained that what happened is after they put the bodies all in one spot and buried them, they wanted to open up the road from all these ambulances that were abandoned there. So an army bulldozer pushed the ambulances off the road to basically reopen it, and in the process crushed them and destroyed them. So that's the army's explanation to the mangled ambulances. But it is, of course, still under investigation right now.
So, Manny, do you have any sense of the timeline for when we'll actually hear the final investigation from the higher level investigation, not this one that you're talking about here, the one that actually really scrutinizes each one of these claims and tries to connect the dots?
I'm not sure how long. I mean, I remember with the incident when Israel bombed the World Central Kitchen vehicles in Gaza around a year ago. And in that case, it was investigated by the same mechanism. And it took about, I think, a week, maybe 4 or 5 days, I think, even, to get an answer from them. Generally, this mechanism doesn't publish statements or anything. It's usually internal investigations that could result in indictment or punishments of soldiers, but none of that has happened so far. But I remember it taking a few days, maybe like 4 or 5 days for an answer. So that could be the case again here, although they already began investigating. Remember, this incident is from 2 weeks ago now, so it could be sooner than we think.
Okay, Manny, let's go to a short break.
Like I and my wife, like we were mourning with people, but because of the way that things have changed, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, there was a feeling that, and this is the substance of an exchange I had in Dissent with another member of the magazine's editorial board, the kind of progressive movement, I think a lot of people in the progressive movement felt, well, if we make a big deal out of Jewish pain and suffering in the wake of October 7th, it'll be instrumentalized and used to justify the war. That's like a generous interpretation. And my argument was actually not mourning legitimates the war. And this is because people don't understand also how like Israelis feel themselves to be in the world. That if you were able to mourn, then you also might be able to say to people, look, like this, what happened is heinous and horrible. And there is another way other than living by the sword forever. But when the world's response to this is you got what you deserved and this is even a good thing, well, you only confirm the sentence that the whole world is against us.
And we're back. The IDF released footage from the entry into the so-called Morag corridor, which is located between southern Gaza's Rafah and Khan Yunis. That was from about Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. And Wednesday marked the first time since the beginning of the war that ground troops operated in that area. Now, on Thursday, the new spokesperson, Israel Defense spokesman Brigadier General Efi Defrin, told reporters that the IDF has entered a, quote, new phase in the fighting. Let's add to this one more layer. And on Friday, the Hamas terror group said in a statement that it will not move any living Israeli hostages out of areas in the Gaza Strip that the IDF has ordered to evacuate from. So let's put all of this together. And what is this new phase that Defrin, we have to get used to that name, that Defrin is referring to?
It's no longer Hagari. So this new phase is essentially Israel capturing this area between Rafah and Khan Yunis and evacuating the entirety of Rafah in the process. Although Hamas, of course, is now saying it won't evacuate hostages if they are indeed held in those areas. That's not something that we can even detail because it's sensitive. But regardless, Israel is capturing this new corridor. It basically means that instead of Israel holding a sort of a 1 kilometer strip of land on the Egypt-Gaza border area, it will now be holding up to 5-6 kilometers in southern Gaza. So it basically is, I wouldn't really call it a second corridor, but it's more like one very, very large corridor now that is basically expanding all the way up to the edge of Khan Yunis. That's the current operation right now, carried out by the 36th Division. It's ongoing. The army is not detailing a lot about this operation. They say that they want to retain their ambiguity to surprise Hamas. But we do know in general that's where the army is working to capture. And in the north of Gaza, something similar is happening as well, where troops are pushing in from the north and expanding Israel's buffer zone further into North Gaza. So If it was up to a kilometer, it's now going to push in another kilometer in, taking more land in Gaza, so reaching up to the Jabalia area. And this is essentially what Defense Minister Israel Katz has been saying, that as long as Hamas doesn't release the hostages, Israel will keep taking more land in Gaza and holding it for the Israeli army as its security perimeter.
So as the IDF is increasingly entering Gaza, of course, the Gazans themselves are trying to evacuate. But is it still the case that there is no humanitarian zone anymore in the Strip?
Yeah, there is no designated humanitarian zone in Gaza, but there's sort of an explanation for it. Right now, humanitarian aid isn't entering Gaza, right? Israel halted all the entry of aid when it resumed its operations against Hamas. And as such, I mean, the humanitarian zone was aimed for aid to go to a specific place in Gaza where most of the aid is directed. If there's no aid entering Gaza, then there's no humanitarian zone. And Israel is calling on civilians, from what I've seen from their announcements, is calling on Palestinian civilians to head for known shelters. So this is areas like schools or hospitals where the UN has set up sort of camps for displaced people. But there isn't one big zone in Gaza that's now considered the humanitarian zone. It's all over Gaza. There's shelters in specific areas, and that's where civilians are going to. Mainly because there's no aid entering Gaza, so there's nowhere to actually sort of concentrate all that aid into one place. It could be in the future that if we reach another agreement and aid continues to enter Gaza, that they'll re-establish the zone, maybe in a different area of Gaza. But as it stands, there isn't one right now.
That's really interesting, because I suppose my assumption had been that this zone was also a no bomb kind of zone, that it wasn't only about the aid, but you're saying no, that was never the idea here.
Yeah, the humanitarian zone isn't right. It's not necessarily a no bomb zone. Israel definitely bombed it less than other areas that are, combat zones where actual fighting is taking place. But the being in the humanitarian zone didn't sort of absolve you of not being targeted. Mohammed Def, Hamas's military commander, was killed in the humanitarian zone alongside the Rafa Salama, the commander of the Khan Yunis brigade there. They were in the humanitarian zone. Israel didn't issue an evacuation warning before they carried out the strike. Civilians were killed in that strike as well, because they were in an area that was next to displaced people. But yeah, the humanitarian zone is not as it's commonly been called, and incorrectly called, the safe zone. It's not a safe zone. It's safer, but it's not an area where Israel doesn't target at all.
And essentially what Katz is saying at this point is there is no safe zone anywhere. And of course, we know that these schools and hospitals have been used as headquarters for Hamas. So not easy. Yes. Okay. So let's move on to a senior Hamas commander who was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Lebanon, in Sidon. And Hassan Farhat had headed the Hamas's forces in the western sector of Lebanon, according to the IDF. So who was he, and what is he accused of having done?
So the army has said that Farhat, and he's considered a relatively senior Hamas commander in Lebanon. The army said that he had advanced numerous attacks on Israel during the war. He was responsible for a rocket attack on the northern command base in Sfat in February last year, 2024, which killed a soldier, Sergeant Omer Benjo, and wounded other soldiers. A rare major rocket attack from Lebanon that was not carried out by Hezbollah. And the army said that he was targeted because in recent months he was involved in advancing terror attacks against Israel. It's interesting to note sort of his involvement in planning terror attacks, is because recently we saw another strike hitting a senior Hezbollah commander in Beirut, if you remember, and the army said that he was coordinating with Hamas to carry out major terror attacks against Israel. So there's definitely a network of Hamas members and senior operatives still in Lebanon who are working alongside Hezbollah or Iran even to carry out attacks on Israel. and using Lebanon to sort of plan their activities. So I don't think this will be the last Hezbollah or Hamas commander that Israel will be targeting in Lebanon. There's still quite a significant Hamas presence there. And with Hamas weakened in Gaza, it's not surprising that the terror group is trying to carry out attacks from other areas against Israel.
On Friday, the IDF and Shin Bet said that a terror operative who oversaw the kidnapping and likely also was involved in the murder of Shiri Bibas and her two sons, Ariel and Kfir, was killed in an airstrike in Gaza. Let's talk about this person as well. What do you know about him?
So on Friday, the Mujahideen Brigades, which is a relatively small terror group in Gaza, somewhat allied with Hamas, they announced that a senior commander of theirs, Muhammad Awad, the head of its intelligence division, was killed in an Israeli airstrike, and then shortly after, the army also announced that Awad was targeted. According to the IDF, Awad oversaw or led the abduction of Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir Bibas when he invaded Kibbutz Nir Oz on October 7th. The army says he was also likely involved in their murder during the early weeks of the war, though that's not sort of confirmed finally yet. He was also involved or responsible for the abductions of Gadi Hagai and Judith Weinstein, U.S.-Israeli nationals, also abducted from Nir Oz. They were killed during the onslaught, and their bodies were abducted to Gaza. The army says that also several Thai nationals who were abducted as well that day, sort of also under his responsibility. When the terror group was involved in the invasion, right? It wasn't just Hamas that invaded Israel. It was other terror groups, Islamic Jihad and Mujahideen brigades, which are, of course, relatively small, but he was, according to Israel, involved in these abductions and murders.
So, Manny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.